All right. Thank you very much, Rich. Do appreciate WSP's support. You're always very helpful for us wherever we go in the world, and it's nice to have your help here. So, I'm going to talk to you about Innovation City. We've put in quite a bit of work having a little think about how Auckland can better manage growth. And we've depended on quite a few of our members for this. Actually, no fewer than 13 of our members have helped feed into this piece of research. A lot of time, a lot of effort's gone in, so I do appreciate the support we get from you, and that's us here today. We're about 100 members, that's you, and so this is your event, and I hope you've had a good time. So, what on earth is the infrastructure organisation looking at urban development, Innovation City? Well, it's not really urban development Innovation City which has driven us. It's actually transport. We did a piece of research last year, and we started looking at some of the transport data coming through, and it was getting a little bit dark. And some of the work was luckily updated with ATAP. There's some of the good stuff that ATAP delivered. You'll notice probably that middle bottom map there shows some inter-peak congestion. And what you probably can't quite make out there is little black lines. They mean that the volume to capacity ratio on the key corridors heading to the Auckland CBD are going to be above 1. That means more cars are going to want to use those corridors throughout the day than those corridors can fit within 10 years. That's all day congestion. That's not good. We don't want that. We need to find a way around it. So we had a little look at, why is this happening? We had a look at the spending. The spending's gone up. It's gone up big. Why is the transport going down if the spending's going up? Spending might explain why it was bad in the first place. We've just about had a threefold increase in spending. Can more be done? Of course more can be done, but spending alone doesn't explain why we're seeing deterioration, rapid deterioration in Auckland's transport performance. Just highlighted the first decade there because of course we're actually trying so hard to fill the transport demand gap. We're actually now spending money we don't even have yet. So what we actually have available is that. So we're actually not even able to afford to meet all of the outcomes that we think we want to achieve. So if it's not spending, what is it? It's population growth. And you might have seen a graph like that. Look at that. Population growth. Auckland has been smacked in the face with some pretty significant population growth. But our transport problems didn't start in 2013. And actually, if you look at that same data over the longer term, it's not that scary. And in fact, if we have a look at Russell's hometown of Brisbane, they've had worse problems. They don't have the congestion that Auckland has, and they don't have the housing affordability challenges that Auckland have. So, population growth is an excuse for problems. It's not an explanation. So what's really going on is that. It's growth. More precisely, it's that combined with that. We have land use and transport misalignment in Auckland. And that's a wonk term, so I'm going to thrash it out a little bit for you just very, very quickly. We've got urban expansion going on all over the place. There it is there. About one job for every 2 homes, give or take, across the sort of those 3 corners of the city, if you like. And there are the jobs. Got homes, got jobs, but they're not particularly close to each other. People are going to be driving to get those jobs. Yep, some will catch public transport, but the modelling showing that actually a lot of them are going to drive, they're going to fill up the corridors. Got intensification. That's fine, that's good. Growing cities got to intensify to some extent. But look where all our money's going. You can see a rail line there, and you can see the density. Density's not necessarily along the rail line. So we've got growth emerging in places where we're not spending money to service that growth. This graph, particularly the one on the left, is one of the most important graphs I think I've come across. It's particularly interesting. That was a sort of a comparison done of Auckland's overall space for movement. And as you can see there on the cities that the UN compared us to, actually Auckland's space for movement is very, very small. We've developed a low-density city, and we've provided transport capacity for a low-density city. We've got narrow, winding streets. We don't have intersections. You want to suddenly intensify there, well, you've got to probably widen the roads to get a bus down or a cycleway or something like that. Very, very expensive. Are we planing that? Not necessarily. In many cases, we're just assuming that these areas designed for low density can accommodate greater growth. Transport modelling is showing it doesn't work. Here's another way of looking at that same problem. There's another place around where Russell is, and there's Mission Bay in Auckland. Those red lines you see on there are both a kilometre. We're sort of at the same scale. And yet you can sort of see down there in Surfers a very densely developed place. Sometimes compared to Mission Bay, which is why I use this example. But you can see, look at all the gaps in Surfers. Those gaps you see, not so much the water, but those gaps you see are space for movement. There's light rail, there's transport corridors, there's wide roads for getting trucks and service vehicles down. You look at Mission Bay, I mean, you need a magnifying glass to find where the roads are. There's no space for movement. We allow growth in these areas, it's going to materialise as congestion. That's what the modelling's telling us. We don't have a transport problem in Auckland, we have a land use problem. And our problem definition is wrong. We keep trying to fix this problem with whatever transport solutions. But as long as we keep allowing land use to be misaligned with transport, we can't solve the problem. That's the first big point. It's not just transport. There's a good little report actually out today before I touch on the positively scaring outcomes of housing. It's not just transport. A good water report came out today talking about stormwater. We're not even measuring some of those impacts. It's pretty scary where stormwater's going, frankly. Not just in Auckland, but across New Zealand, but it's certainly not as scary as the housing, of course. There we go, six-fold increase in housing prices over the last 25 years, doubled in the last 6 or 7. There's inflation. It's marginally above inflation, you'd have to say. Value of Auckland housing now well clear of $500 billion. Market cap of the New Zealand Stock Exchange is $130 billion. We've got 4 stock exchanges in the Auckland housing market. Median house price up around $825. Median incomes around $85K. You need 10 incomes to buy a house in Auckland. And guess what? It might get worse. And it can get worse. Well, it will get worse unless something happens pretty quickly. Look on that graph there. You'll see a little circle that shows us, we think we've actually fixed the problem in Auckland, evidently, because we're starting to pull back on the consents. Actually, housing construction is lower again. Consents, that's where they need to be. That's where they are. House construction's actually at 7,000 units. We need 14,000, so we're halfway there. We've got a housing deficit in Auckland of 40,000 dwellings. It's the difference between how many people have come into the city in the last 20 years and how many houses haven't been built. 40,000, it's growing by 20 a day. We've got 20 people a day staying at home with the parents mostly, but they're also moving into garages, they're also living in cars, they're living in the street. A massive systemic failure to accommodate growth with huge social and economic consequences. So we've got to ask ourselves what we're really trying to achieve in Auckland, don't we? Was it more housing? Because we're not achieving that. Is it a conversion to public transport? Modelling showing that that's not working that well. Were we trying to fix carbon? Carbon's not going down, and probably if you're trying to fix carbon, the biggest thing you'd probably want to do actually is migrate to electric vehicles. Is it protecting our productive soil? We're building on the best agricultural soil in New Zealand right now. Go online, have a look at Trade Me. You can buy, cheap as chips, you can buy land on soil which is ideal for producing food right now. There's only a little bit of in Auckland, but we're building on it. Is it a livable city? There's no point in having a livable city if no one can afford to live in it. We're delivering a city, a let-them-eat-cake city. That's where we've gone. It's not working. So we've got to do something. So we thought, we've got to have a look at this. We're coming from an infrastructure perspective. We've got to find some way of meeting our infrastructure demands. But there's 3 big problems we've got in Auckland. We've got a transport problem, and actually a wider infrastructure one, but certainly transport's the one with the best evidence behind it. We've got some pretty significant housing problems, and we've also finding out that we can't actually afford to solve either problem. So we wanted to try a different solution. We wanted to try, what if you could, well, we're going to build some homes. We want them aligned with transport and jobs, try and get that movement issue sorted. And we've got to somehow leverage land value, private capital to get this thing done affordably. So that's where that concept of integrated urban development at scale came from. Thought we'd test a city of 100,000, so that's roughly equivalent to the 40,000 households we're short. We moderated it down slightly to 30,000 homes, and that was really to fit around a sort of a spread of high, medium and low density housing. And we opted for a greenfield solution, and that's to do with speed. Getting into brownfields is complicated. You've got to get through all sorts of approval processes, and there's opposition. Very difficult to get scale in a brownfield environment, and very, very, very difficult to get affordable land to which you can leverage that value and deliver affordable housing. So that's why we thought we'd test this. Let's see if it works. Let's see what the costs look like. Let's see if we can deliver it in a way which delivers some much better urban outcomes. So we had a look around. Where would you fit 30,000 homes and 30,000 jobs? And sorry, I should point out too, these are additional. We've sort of looked and said, look, unitary plan's in place, there it is, we can't change that. Nobody in the world wants to relitigate the unitary plan. We're going to talk about really solving this 100,000 problem. Where can we fit something that meets this growth? So we looked around for sort of 2,000 hectares. And actually, there's tons of places around Auckland with 2,000 hectares of more or less flat, rollishing land. There was no geotechs obviously done on this, it's more of a desktop. But as you can see, there's actually tons of land. It's sort of in the north, northwest, and we picked a couple of examples from, or one example from each corner of the city, including the east. You probably wouldn't go anywhere near Clevedon, to be honest, but we wanted to compare it. Took out the elite soils in Pukekohe, didn't build on the reservoirs for very equally obvious reasons, but came up with those 5 locations there, sort of Dairy Flat, Silverdale area, essentially in the area that's already zoned. Wanted to compare the land value particularly there. Kumeu South up in the northwest, Clevedon in the east, Karaka and Pairata in the south. So we thought, well, we're an infrastructure organisation, we want to see how much it costs to service these areas. So we looked, and as you can see here, Karaka turns out pretty cheap, and from a water supply perspective, Clevedon doesn't. That's a big number that Watercare would have to pick up there if growth is put in one place or another. And we see the same things with water supply. As you see, Pairata is actually very cheap because, of course, the Waikato pipeline goes through there, so Watercare won't have to throw a lot of money at it. But crikey, if growth goes up north, again, this is an additional 30,000 homes to what's planned. You know, Watercare will be on the table there for $115 million. That's serious, serious money. See the Transpower. Chorus actually, funnily enough, has updated their figures now. They probably think they can service an area that large for about 125 mil. So they've updated their figures. So a little bit lower there, which is good. But in the end, you should be able to see there that Pairata came out. In terms of our electricity, our water, our telco, Pairata came out about the cheapest. And up north actually came out the most expensive. So that works out at sort of 25K per house. Actually not that much. So that was that. Then we had to go into transport. Transport's a lot trickier, it's a lot more political, so we couldn't lean on the experts the same way we could for the other big services. So we had to develop networks that were broadly comparable. Again, we leant heavily on the supporting growth stuff by ATAP and all that work. So figured we could sort of throw an extra 30,000 within the 4,000 hectares up north, sort of doubled the density. Again, and then made provision for widening roads and whatnot, and did the same for Clevedon, Karaka, Pairata, Kumeu. So when we did the numbers on that sort of stuff, we see there's sort of 2 groups there. Again, we're not able to get the numbers down close enough, but you can just sort of see 2 groups forming there. There's the groups which have big strategic investment already committed through supporting growth, so they're not included in that little circle there. And that's why the costs are very low. But in those areas where you have to throw in big strategic investments, you have to extend motorways, man, look at those costs. And this is a very important point about hitting triggers of strategic infrastructure. You hit these triggers, you're on the hook for serious money. As you can see there, I mean, the transport, those, you know, to do up your regional arterials, you're only talking about $20,000 a dwelling on average. It's when you get to the strategic stuff that you get hit. So, you know, if you grow up in Dairy Flat in Silverdale and you hit a trigger point for having to turn your busway into a light rail, you're on the hook for $5 billion, give or take. If you have to build a harbour crossing, you're on the hook for another $5 billion. If you get into QMU South and you have to triple track the rail line in order to support some growth there, you might be on the hook for about $3 billion. If you go to Clevedon, oh look, Clevedon's a really tricky one because it connects so poorly, and that's tricky. I mean, we've got we've sort of threw $1 billion figure there, but as you can see, we put a sort of a risk assessment on this stuff, which is probably more something probably better to focus on. But massive risks in somewhere like at Clevedon, less risks in Pirata. The big cost there, and this was quite interesting. I mean, it's $2 billion. That $2 billion would allow you to four-track between Papakura and Westfield. That would allow you to have 4 lines between a Pirata city and the CBD. Now, what's interesting about that, of course, is then you could separate your commuter services from your rail freight services. Kiwi Rail could start to operate its services throughout the day instead of having to stop and waiting for commuter traffic. That's pretty interesting, isn't it? You could have non-stop services from a Pirata city to the CBD. You'd be within 30 minutes of the CBD, running all day if you wanted. If you tie that in with the land use, well, that's an interesting thought, isn't it? And that's $2 billion, actually. Not that much. Karaka actually was probably the risks are pretty low. That's because, of course, the big investments were tied up in the initial additions that we assumed that would cross the Pahurihuri Inlet and so forth. So down there, and you can sort of see, you know, once you start to include, if you were, and it's not fair, admittedly, but if you were to attach these big strategic investments to development, the cost per dwelling starts to go up by factors. You know, if you have to hit the trigger for converting to light rail and harbour crossings in Silverdale, you're going to be up to $300,000 or $400,000 a dwelling average cost. Let's avoid hitting those triggers. And there are the others. Right, so then we had a look at, okay, well, infrastructure's one thing, it's not everything. What's the land cost? So we went on to CoreLogic there and had a little look and see, you know, what does land cost in these areas? If it's really cheap, we might be able to offset some of the infrastructure costs. As you see there, Dairy Flat, Silverdale, very, very expensive. QMU as well, usually to do with the land parcel size. You see, it's mostly lifestyle blocks there, so you've got to buy a house in a smaller section. You get into Clevedon, Pirata and Karaka, you're buying farms and whatnot. So bigger sections, a lot easier. So that really started to push us south. We're starting, all the evidence is starting to say come south. And look at the price of land there. We had to make some estimates up to the 2014 data, so we put some estimates in there based on sales data. And as you can see, land prices in Dairy Flat rising quickly. So it's pretty expensive now to buy land, just raw land in that Dairy Flat, Silverdale area. So then we sort of added that all up and sort of said, land plus infrastructure. Where are we going to highlight? Where's the place that you would start to think about a satellite city if you're taking an infrastructure-led approach? And Pirata came out best. I'm not moving. All right. So look, Pirata just kept coming up. The land's pretty affordable still, rising quickly, it must be said. Got a big rail line through it, and the rest of the infrastructure is not too expensive. So then we thought, all right, well, got to do the development costs. I'm not going to go through this fascinating piece of work from Harrison Grierson, but if you get a chance, there'll be reports at the back, and have a look through that. It's absolutely fascinating. $1 billion of development contributions if you were to build at this sort of scale. Development contributions are having a big impact on our ability to build at scale. We're going to have to rethink the development contributions model. In the end, the development costs are going to cost you about $77,000, so just about triple some of the other infrastructure costs. That's big. These are the local costs. They're big. That's a lot of risk putting on developers. It's developers who pick up the tab here. That's a lot of risk they've got to take. We did some work about home construction. You know, what do you do? I mean, one of the key things about the whole project is we want to get some scale. We want to move to different models of building homes. So we put in some estimates about prefab, but that's absolutely critical to something like this, is enabling a shift to new ways of delivering homes, giving suppliers the confidence to invest in factories rather than, orders for 5 or 10 homes and having to take the risk if they want to build a factory. Let's order it big, allow some investment and scale production. And we did some little work around employment again. We wanted to have a little look there. What comes out in the south is that there's a big need for big social investment. What if we tied that together with the growth? What sort of concept comes out of there? What's an innovation concept? Actually, it's about health, it's about education. Te Papa North's a big museum project. So added up the cost there and divided it by sort of number of units. It actually comes out pretty reasonable, about 375,000 if you assume that energy and telco are picked up. It's about 375, so that's about 430, including that's a raw cost of a home. There's no provision for risk or profit in there. That's like a raw cost. That's about as cheap as you could build in Auckland. Right? Then we wanted to say, well, what's the value? What can we generate if we do this? So we looked at a couple of different places. We looked at Karaka, we looked at Pocono, and we said we'll take the land value in between. Karaka's a very, very nice development, higher end, 5 kilometres closer to the city, so it's going to be more valuable. Pocono's 12 kilometres south. Probably the land will be slightly less. We'll take the middle. Comes out at about 9 million a hectare. So that's what we sort of assumed, that the housing, once you build that housing, that's where the land's going to get to. So don't forget, in Pirata, that land, some of that land, you were buying it for only $200,000 or $300,000 a hectare. It's going to be worth $9 million once you put houses there, once you zone it, once you get infrastructure. So if we look at the land value uplift, and we start to put houses there, and we start to look at that land value, you get these massive, massive figures. The development would start to look like $11 billion. There's $640 million of land there. We're probably going to have $12 billion of residential housing once you're done. That comes to about $360,000 of dwellings. We sort of had to bring it back to have a look. Costs about $100,000 if you take out the energy and the telco. It costs about $100,000 to get that land value. Turns into $360,000. So there's sort of a $250,000 buffer, a window there. That's interesting. That sort of gives you something to work with if the council and or government was to work with the landowners and say, hey, we've got something here that we can take to you and say, hey, look, if your land's not zoned, it's not got infrastructure. There's 250k here. We can help you build faster and better, and we could maybe take some of the risk off your shoulders, and in return, obviously, you'll be demanding less of a price. And that's the window. So that's where we sort of got to there. Had a little look also at some of the other value uplift opportunities, and what's very clear there is that the government does very nicely out of development. Somewhere between 2 to 4 billion, depending what projects go in and what houses sell like. Council doesn't do that well at all. Does maybe 50 to 100 off the residential stuff. Government gets all the money. So we sort of had a look, what that difference represents. And some of that is good development. Someone like Karaka Lakes is a very nice development. You expect the developer to make profit from doing good development, but part of it's also zoning and infrastructure. To the extent that profit is not from the good development, to the extent that there's a problem in our growth management, we've got a transfer of value from public activities around infrastructure and zoning into land values. That's the bit we're trying to capture. So if you can capture it, you can either start to build homes faster, cheaper, or you can start to fund more infrastructure. That's what we're trying to do here. So the opportunity's there. We looked at delivery models, and that's about looking at risk. And what becomes very, very clear very quickly is that there are probably two groups that really take the risk in development. They're the developers and the councils. But they're not necessarily the people that get the upside. Yep, developers will get upside if they do a good job. Councils pretty much don't get anything. Look, the council does get some big DCs out of development in Auckland, and in a place like Pirata, the DCs actually might be too high. But if we allow growth in some areas and we hit those trigger points for big regional investments, the DCs are not even scratching the surface. So we sort of looked at a few different models there, and in terms of whether a UDA bought land, but essentially, obviously the easiest and the fastest model, the most practical, is if you had an urban development agency supported by the government's balance sheet, working with landowners and basically saying, look, we know that this is what we can build the houses at if we work together. You go build, you sell them for whatever you want, and we will lower our costs, our infrastructure and zoning costs, so that you can build fast, and if you can't sell houses, maybe we'll buy them at that cost, but we're going to lower your risk to get more houses built fast. So we started to look at that. It starts to look actually pretty appetising. We can build in Auckland for 400,000 or 500,000. That's what Aucklanders can afford. Can be done. At the moment, we're building $7, $8, $9 million. That's great if you want $1 million houses, but we've got people that need $400,000 houses. It can be done. And it needs to be done, actually. It's not okay what we're doing. So we think, we actually think it probably works. We think it certainly deserves a lot more thought. We've got to think about doing things differently in Auckland. It's not working at the moment. You can't keep people on the street forever. And with proving the model, I mean, we thought, look there, that actually works. That works better. That appears to work better than what we're doing currently. Why don't we take it further?